So maybe sin and shame were around as a human experiences before anybody ever labeled it, before anybody talked about it, taught about it, um, noticed it, and then supported other people in relaxing. Before any churches started, maybe there was distress and shame and psychological suffering and agonizing and guilt, sorrow. So did Moses invent imprudent behavior, like behaviors that have potentially negative consequences, dangerous consequences? Did Moses invent those behaviors, or did he just talk about some patterns of behavior that were already popular or were already recognizable, already well known? That's what I mean by popular. I don't mean that 90% of people did it 90% of the time, but when he talks about lying or cheating, well, people already knew what lying and cheating were, or stealing. They already knew what he was talking about. I assert, when he said things about lying and stealing, people knew what he was talking about. He didn't have to invent the word. He just said, okay, let's talk about some things that work. Let's refrain from the following behaviors. These are forbidden. If you want to, experience peace and everything, don't do this stuff, okay? Here's what not to do, and he lists various behaviors. How about Buddha? Did Buddha invent psychological suffering and distress and sorrow? Or did he just talk about something that was already present, was already familiar to the people he was talking to? Did Freud invent emotional distress, mental disorder, madness, anger, rage, hysteria, paranoia? Or did he just explore something that was already familiar, and then he subcategorized it and made, instead of 10 labels, 100 labels, and then 1,000 subcategories of all these different patterns of neuro-linguistic program? So these are people talking about things that are already phenomena that already exist. They're refining terminology about things and precisely labeling things that actually gives the potential for people to acknowledge something, recognize it, and then just notice it and no longer condemn it, no longer be afraid of it. Oh, okay. So that's shouting, okay? So I notice shouting, okay? That's agonizing. Once somebody really understands, really, from having done it and from having witnessed it, what agonizing is, then they might stop trying to figure out what's the right, it's so hard. I start with this idea that something's wrong, and then I'm gonna have to make it right, and it's gonna be really hard to do that. I have to get everybody else's approval to do that. What's gonna work to do that? Everybody else's, well, I got John's approval, but not Sally's. What else can I do? So once somebody knows what agonizing is, then anytime agonizing shows up, it's just clearly agonizing. Anxiety, agonizing, worrying, fretting. Once somebody's really clear what those things are, then it's really clear what those things are. There's no condemning of it. There's no need to be afraid of it. There's no need to be preoccupied with it. I don't need to avoid it. I just can recognize it, and then immediately, if I recognize myself agonizing, I can go, oh, that's not very effective, is it? That sounds like I must be frustrated and in distress to even be in the mode of agonizing. How about I relax and interrupt my own, by the time I notice it, that's already an interruption of the agonizing. How do you stop agonizing? Well, let's figure it out. How do I stop agonizing? Oh, man, this is a tough one. No, it's not tough. You stop agonizing by not doing it. It's kind of like how do you stop juggling, is you don't juggle. How do you stop agonizing? Once you're clear what agonizing is, then you can persist in agonizing when you notice yourself agonizing, or not. So, back to institutions and talking about shame and agonizing and original sin and ideas like that. Well, some institutions may be more clear than others, just like some people may be more clear than others about the reality of original sin or shame or agonizing. And the original sin, I'm calling it the fearing of fear, fearing the exposure of fear. I don't want other people to know I'm afraid, because I'm afraid that if they know that I'm afraid, then it's going to go very poorly. That's a completely understandable, completely reasonable experience. Many people may have had it, even you, being reserved and discreet about letting other people know if you're afraid. Fearing the exposure of fear. Paranoia, anxiety, shame. I don't want them to know I'm afraid. That's shame. I've got to figure out how to keep them from knowing that I'm afraid. Anxiety, agonizing. Oh my God, I think they might know. Paranoia. Oh, why did he look at me like that? Why is she saying nothing? I think that maybe they're catching on, right? So if there's this background of shame and distress and anxiety, then paranoia is kind of like natural. So some people may begin more clear than others about perfection, and the huge difference between eventually becoming perfect and already being perfect. Being perfectly accepting, confused about what it means to be perfect, and they think, oh, be perfect, that means become perfect? Well, if somebody has that confusion, that lack of linguistic clarity, that lack of fluency with spiritual vocabulary, well, that might be familiar. You might have done that kind of thing yourself. So if somebody else is in a mode of distress or a mode of panic and confusing being perfect with becoming perfect, that's fine. Nothing wrong with becoming perfect either. But it does require this sense of imperfection. What if I fail to meet a standard? That's completely possible. I might have done that several times. So being perfect doesn't mean I necessarily fulfill every possible standard or that I've always done it. It's ridiculous. Standards are like divisions between what's exceptional, what's normal, and what's substandard. And some of those things can be, measured quite precisely, and some things are not so easily measured. But there are standards, there are morals, there are norms, there are rules, there are laws in terms of a society and what's accepted, what's promoted, what's rewarded, what's punished. And those things change over time and change from place to place. So did you ever have any confusion or, let's say, an imperfect understanding of the very simple and logical idea of being perfect? Being perfect is very simple and logical. Did you ever have any confusion about being perfect? If you can accept that you had if you can accept that you ever had an imperfect understanding of being perfect, then how easy could it be to accept that other people may have also had an imperfect understanding and may still? They may still be confused. They may still be ignorant. Can you accept that other people might be ignorant? If you know that you've been ignorant, if I know that I've been ignorant and confused, can I accept that other people may be ignorant and confused? Or would I reactively condemn them? I can accept it. There's somebody who's totally ignorant. There's somebody who's a little bit confused. There's somebody who's very confused and in a lot of distress. I would be able to make those kinds of distinctions. I would notice those kind of distinctions. Not that they would necessarily be of great interest, but I would notice them, and they might be of interest. Here's another English translation of an old Aramaic teaching. For to the pure, everything is pure, but to those who are defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure, but their mind and conscience is defiled, or confused, or in distress. I added those last few words. That's Titus 1:15 from the New Testament. That's Aramaic. That's English translations directly from the Aramaic. That was from the Aramaic Bible in plain English from 2010. That Bible hasn't been around very long because the old Aramaic script was not available for direct translation into English. It used to be that all these Bibles would be translated into some other language like Greek or Latin or something, and then another 1,000 years later or whatever, 1,500, 2,000 years later, translated into a third language, English or Spanish or whatever. For the pure, everything is pure. To the perfect, everything is perfect. But to those who are defiled and unbelieving, who insist on imperfection, well, then they're gonna find imperfection in the world around them, not just within themselves. Before they will admit to and notice their own patterns, which they're condemning as imperfect, they're going to notice things in the world. They're going to condemn that group, that politician, that neighbor, that pattern. There'll be the condemning of patterns. It's a evidence of distress. If somebody's condemning things as disgusting and disturbing, that's disturbance. That means that there's the reaction of disturbance within them. It is possible for someone else to witness that same thing and not be disturbed. Now, that could be a lack of perception on someone's part, like a blind person and a person that has great vision can face the same direction with their eyes open and have totally different experiences. But what if somebody's totally perceptive, totally cognizant of a particular pattern, yet doesn't reject it or condemn it? What if someone can talk about any pattern without an inner experience of shame or terror or disgust? Which month is most disgusting? Which number is most disgusting? Which letter is most evil and disturbing? Well, at some point, it seems a bit silly to talk about things as inherently disgusting or inherently disturbing. No, there's a subjective experience of disturbance or disgust that's possible, but that's independent, absolutely independent of the thing itself. A loud noise isn't inherently disturbing, not for someone who's deaf. A clash of colors isn't inherently ugly, except to someone who can see. Someone who's colorblind won't even notice it. Or someone who's just not that interested. Someone who's focused on other things won't as easily be disturbed or distracted because they're focused. They're concentrated. They're concentrating. For the one who is perfect, the world is already perfect. Threats to God's power, competitors. Many people say they worship God, yet they give their attention to an alleged devil. Note that fear is a form of attention. People fear the devil. They're preoccupied about the devil. Again, completely okay. We can say it's a developmental stage. However, it might be a developmental stage that's kind of disturbing and kind of challenging. And we can notice, wow, that's tough. That's a tough stage to experience. Yeah, that's a great one to get mastered, but it's a tough one sometimes to go through that dark night of the soul. That noticing of one's inner fear and inner shame and allowing that labeling of things that's imperfect to just be a possible labeling. Many say they worship God, yet give their attention to a scapegoat, to a devil, to a villain, to an enemy, to an adversary. In fact, I might have done the same thing myself. So this is all very simple logic. Anything that can be conceived, certainly anything that can be labeled, but anything that can be conceived or perceived can be accepted without condemnation or distress, or with condemnation and distress and disturbance and disgust. Anything could be disgusting or disturbing to someone at some time. And anything could be accepted and noticed without an experience of condemnation or distress. There is a purpose for each and everything, for all patterns, for all of creation, for the whole universe. Whatever happens in the future included. God creates all of it, both the night and the day, good and evil, arrogance and humility, hatred and love, illness and health, safety and war, sin or shame and salvation or relief or relaxation or innocence or humor, but also seriousness. God creates being perfect, and God creates promoting hysteria about how to eventually earn your way into heaven if you just do the perfect rituals in the perfect way, in the perfect sequence, at the perfect time, plus save the world from all competing philosophies, as long as your entry fees for heaven are also postmarked by the entry deadline. And you have to address the envelope in the perfect way or else it won't get to its destination. I'm paraphrasing there from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. From the Old Testament, Ecclesiastes chapter 3. There's a link on the blog if you care to be reminded of the actual English translation of the Old Hebrew that's probably familiar to you from that song from the late 60s by the Byrds, Turn, Turn, Turn. To everything there is a season, for every purpose under God, under heaven. A time to sow and a time to reap. A time to bring things together and a time to separate things apart. All that stuff. None of those things are disgusting or disturbing inherently. None of them require condemning. Condemning is optional. Condemning